It seems to be an unwritten rule that films will, more often than not, receive a tie-in video game that is forgettable at best. Occasionally a game will be released that bucks this trend by being worthy of the source material, but that's unusual. Even rarer are games that surpass the films they are based on, but that's exactly what happened with Judge Dredd. Now, before we go any further, let's make one thing very clear. The Dredd license and wider 2080 universe itself is not in question here. This game was specifically released as a tie-in to the Judge Dredd film, released in 1995, starring Sylvester Stallone. This film was widely panned by critics and Dredd fans alike for fundamentally missing the tone and character of the comics, despite some impressive costume work and set design. Let's be honest, the movie has Dredd without a helmet half the time. That alone should be a warning sign.
Holy crud.
With all this in mind, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the Judge Dredd tie-in game would be a low-effort stinker. And yet, it's a surprisingly well-crafted platformer. It would have been so easy just to create a fast-paced, simple shooter, throw in some cheap digitized graphics, and call it a day. Instead, you're presented with complex stages, a wide variety of weapons, varied mission objectives, and an interesting risk-reward mechanic that fits the license perfectly. It even looks past the film to include characters and other elements from the comic book series, seamlessly blending them into the game alongside the film-specific content. The game loosely follows the story beats of the movie. As Dredd, you'll purge the slums of Mega City 1, explore the desert landscapes of the Cursed Earth, and even scale the Statue of Liberty. However, the game also draws on the comic book to send you to other areas like Mega City 2, Justice 1, and even to Dead World. It's a surprisingly long game, with a total of 12 levels to make your way through. Luckily, there are passwords for this one, so you won't have to start from scratch every time you turn the system on. Despite the game's length, there are enough wrinkles in the gameplay to prevent it from feeling stale. Dredd's Lawgiver has a variety of ammo types, from bullets that ricochet off the wall, to grenades that can be bounced around tight corners, to the hilarious double whammy.
Double whammy.
Double whammy.
Additionally, the game forces you to be creative with the use of these weapons. Arresting perps is sometimes necessary to fulfill essential mission objectives. It also gives you more points if you're shooting for a high score. It does mean that you can't just pump them full of whatever lethal ammo you have on hand. You may have to use a slightly more awkward type of ammunition to get them to drop their weapons and let you arrest them. There's something about the little floating platform that takes them away that cracks me up every single time. Each stage is a sprawling collection of hallways, platforms, and destructible objects. You can't simply hold right and expect to make your way to the exit. Judge Dredd forces you to explore every level, both horizontally and vertically. This is emphasized by the game's use of mission objectives in each level. These include arresting a certain number of criminals, activating terminals scattered throughout the stage, or finding an item hidden somewhere in the level. These objectives are somewhat simple, but they add another layer to the gameplay that forces you to think a bit more about your approach than your average platformer at the time. The game is definitely a looker. The color palette matches the movie fairly closely, with grimy browns and blacks offset by neon highlights and vivid explosions. Some areas, like the Cursed Earth, brighten things up and provide some great contrast throughout the game. The sprites are even more impressive. There's a rotoscope-esque quality to the animation that brings to mind games like Flashback and Karateka. This is matched by a high level of detail to all the sprites, from the basic enemies to the boss characters, but especially to Dredd himself. Just watching him run around the levels, diving over gaps and headbutting perps in the face is an absolute joy. The audio isn't quite as memorable as the visuals, but it gets the job done. Tracks are generally inoffensive and keep the game moving, though they can sound a little bit muffled. The sound effects are a bit more impressive, with crunchy explosions and gunshots punctuating the somewhat muddy background music. There's not a whole lot going on here, but there's nothing particularly bad either. It's just average, and manages to stay out of the way of the rest of the game. It hurts me to say it, but the Super Nintendo has the best version of the game by far. The additional buttons on the controller gave the player much more choice and agency over the various melee attacks, whilst also having the best presentation. The Mega Drive has slightly worse graphics and music, as often happened with multi-platform games at the time, as well as the control issues preventing the player from using some of the melee attacks available on the Super Nintendo version, like the jump kick. More of a concern are the bizarre changes to the physics of the game in Sega's version. Check out the difference when you're jumping. On the Super Nintendo, you get a good amount of hang time, making it much easier to make your way around the various twists and turns in the stages. On the Mega Drive, Dredd feels much heavier and falls to earth more quickly. It's not game-breaking, but it definitely doesn't feel as good to play as the Super Nintendo version. There was a PC version released too, but it's basically the same as the 16-bit versions, depending on your hardware of course. There were also portable versions of the game retooled and released for the Game Boy and Game Gear, but the game loses a bit in translation. The controls aren't as tight, and the sprawling gameplay is much harder to keep track of on the small screen. The Game Gear version actually looks quite nice, with the sprites translating particularly well to the smaller colour screen. The Game Boy version doesn't fare as well, with the details getting completely lost, and the game looking fairly muddy as a result. They aren't terrible games though, and are still worth a look. The Game Boy version is actually the one I played most of as a kid, and I beat it multiple times, so it can't be that bad. This is one of those games that has been made with far more care than you might expect from a movie tie-in. The license adds a lot of flavour to the game, but even if you stripped all of that out, you would still be left with a creative, complex platformer. It's interesting when you compare it to another licensed game from the same period, Batman Forever. Both of these titles were developed by Probe Entertainment and published by Acclaim. Both were released for a variety of consoles. Both came out in 1995, and yet they couldn't be more different. Batman Forever is a game that attempted to piggyback off the fighting engine and digitized graphics of Mortal Kombat, creating a game that was slow and frustrating to play. More so than that, it just doesn't feel like a Batman game. Instead, it feels like a cynical attempt to mash two totally unrelated franchises together, while they were both hot. Judge Dredd feels like the exact opposite. It's a well-designed game at its core that uses a license to elevate the presentation and gameplay, not just prop it up. This is the kind of licensed product that the Dredd franchise deserved in the first place.